Hello, my name's Dennis Murphy-Odo. I'm going to talk to you today about an introduction to phonics. I'll start off with an agenda, just to give us an idea of where we're going. We'll start with some theories of teaching reading. From there, we'll talk about phonemic awareness, teaching the alphabet, teaching phonics, and we'll finish off with some activity ideas for how to teach phonics. Let's begin with a thought from Mortimer J. Adler. He says, reading is a basic tool in living a good life. When I think about this, I think reading can be helpful for us in a number of ways. For instance, one way is being able to read, being literate, helps us to navigate daily life in modern society. So when we go outside and we take the subway, or when we go to a restaurant, it's assumed that we're able to read the subway signs, or we're able to read the menu at the restaurant. Another way reading is helpful for us is that through vicarious experiences, we can learn from different cultures and different authors around the world. A third way that really is helpful for us as language learners is that reading can give us comprehensible input and more exposure to the language. And this is important because when we read, it's at our pace rather than being at the speaker's pace. And so reading can be really helpful for us in a number of ways. We'll talk about three theories of reading to begin with. The first one is bottom-up view of reading. The second one is a top-down view. And the third one is an interactive view of reading. Before we go on to that, I want to talk a little bit about why, as teachers, we should care about theory and we should be knowledgeable about reading theory at all. One important reason is sometimes we're called upon to defend our methods. A student or a parent or a supervisor might ask us, why is it that you're doing this particular activity, or why are you doing it this way? When we have some knowledge of theory, that enables us to explain why we do what we do in the classroom. Another important reason for knowledge of theory is that it allows us to be consistent as teachers. Often new teachers, when they start out, they might be grabbing an idea from a colleague over here and grabbing another idea from another colleague over here. But the problem is, if they don't have a sound understanding of reading theory, they don't know if these ideas work together or if they conflict with each other. So knowledge of theory helps us sort that out and be aware of that potential pitfall. The difference between knowledge of theory and no knowledge of theory is sort of like the difference between a cook and a chef. A cook can follow other people's recipes, but a chef can invent their own. Well, as a teacher, we don't really have the option. We have to be chefs. And in order to be a chef, we need to know theory. When we know theory, that helps us extrapolate. That helps us to invent new methods. So when we meet students in our classroom who don't react or don't respond in a way we would like to a particular activity, we can adjust that activity and we can change it to meet that student's needs. And that's knowledge of theory allows us to do that. And lastly, probably equally as important to the others, is that it allows us to reflect. When we have a picture of what should be happening in the classroom and in the reader's mind, that allows us to reflect on our practice and what's happening in that room to improve our practice. When we know the theory, we can judge what mistakes we made, and we can think about what we need to do next time to improve. So having talked a little bit about why theory is important, let's look at the first theory. Now, I'm talking here giving us a historical overview of views of the reading process as well. And so the bottom-up view of the reading process was kind of the first scientific view of reading that really came along. And basically it goes like this. When a reader meets a new text, see, for example, if I'm looking at this word, bottom, I come to the word, and the first thing I do is I see the letter. And the letter goes and it matches to a sound in my mind, and I make that connection. And then I go to the very next letter, and I do the same thing. And I do it for the letter after that, and after that, until I get a word. So I go from letters to words. And then I repeat the process with the next word. I add all those words up until I get a sentence. I add all those sentences up until I get a paragraph, add the paragraphs up until I get an entire text. And that's how it progresses. From the bottom, from the very first sound-letter connection, right up through to understanding of the text. And that's how the bottom-up reading process works. Now we can see here, if I give you a moment to read this text, I'll go ahead and read it for us to begin with. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome raths outgrabe." Now that's a famous poem, but I didn't read that because I know what the meaning of any of these words is. In fact, I don't know what any of these words mean, but I'm still able to read that poem. How is that possible? Well, according to bottom-up theory, I'm able to do that because I can match the letters and the sounds that I already know, add them up, get the words, and go through the whole process until I can read the text. But we can see here, as I'm doing this, as I'm talking about this, we can see one of the potential shortcomings of this theory. And that is, we can read a text without necessarily being able to comprehend what it is we're reading. So before long, this theory came along, people were impressed with it for a while, but other researchers started to realize, wait a second, what about comprehension? Where does comprehension fit in here? And these researchers argued, actually, the reading process doesn't work that way. It works in what's called a top-down manner, top-down processing. They argue that using pre-reading activities, using our background knowledge, we're able to preview and predict what's going to happen in the text. We use our previewing, we use our predictions, as well as our background knowledge. Now that includes knowledge of culture and knowledge of how our language works. We use all of this to help us understand the text before and as we read the text. All of this, pre-reading activities, previewing, predictions, background knowledge, we draw all on this, and that's what gives us comprehension. So it's very top-down, going from our knowledge of the world and imposing that understanding on the text, rather than taking information from the text, which is what the bottom-up theory argues. Now we can see, again, this goes like the other diagram we saw, except in reverse. So we go from our knowledge of stories right down to recognizing the letters. But it all starts with background, knowledge of stories, knowledge of language. Now we can see here, we have an example text, and according to this theory, what we would do as a reader is we would come to this text, we would look at the picture of this bear, and we would look at the title, and we would say, "The Hungry Bear at My Cabin." Now when I see that title, I start to activate ideas and knowledge that I have about bears, about hungry bears, and about what they might do at cabins. Now, I could have gotten that knowledge just through my experience living in the world, watching National Geographic, reading other books about bears, reading other storybooks, and I can take all of that knowledge, and that can help me make predictions about what's going to be in this text. And that is the process according to a top-down view of reading. Now the problem, some researchers came along and they realized, well, yes, you know what? That probably is an effective explanation for how strong readers who have a lot of background knowledge read and understand a text. That's a pretty good account for that. But where this theory of reading really falls short is that it doesn't tell us how people first learn to read, or how readers who are struggling with a text come to read. And so, in the early 1990s, some other researchers came along, some other scholars, and they said, actually, the reading process is probably some combination of both. It's a combination of bottom-up processing and top-down processing. And this is called an interactive compensatory model of reading. In essence, how this works is a reader comes to a text, they start to read the text using their background knowledge, but when they come to a word that they don't know, they go from top-down reading of the text using background knowledge, and they switch into a bottom-up reading. And then they look at the individual letters and they start to think about how those letters connect to sounds in their heads. And so they use top-down and bottom-up knowledge of the reading process to compensate for one weakness in the other. So when top-down processing isn't working, I use bottom-up processing. And when bottom-up processing isn't working, I use top-down processing. And that helps me compensate and understand texts that are challenging for me and understand texts that are easy for me. And this is kind of where we still are. In terms of a psychological view of the reading process, we're very much still drawing on this theory. And a lot of the activities and ideas we'll talk about also draw on this theory. So we've talked about interactive approach. We use top-down strategies until we see an unfamiliar word, and then we go into decoding to comprehend, combining both top-down and bottom-up. Now, before we get into phonics in itself, I want to talk about two foundational concepts that we need to have an understanding of before we can teach phonics. And the first of these is this idea of concepts about print. Concepts about print is basically the idea that print has a message. So when I open up a book and I see the squiggles on the page, I understand that those squiggles have a message. I also understand how books work. That is, when I get a book off the shelf, I know where the front of the book is. I know where to open up the book. I know where the first page is, where the first word is, and I know I read from left to right and from top to bottom. Now, we're not born knowing this. We have to learn it, and those conventions can be different depending on the culture. So some of our students whose parents have been reading to them, they often come to school and they have a good knowledge of concepts about print. They know how books work. They've been watching their parents or their older brothers and sisters reading books, so they know how they work. On the other hand, some kids come to school, maybe they haven't been read to as much, or they haven't read with their brothers or sisters. In that case, they don't necessarily come to school with knowledge of concepts about print. So as a teacher, it's important for us to read with and read to our learners as much as possible. And doing this will help them get a knowledge of concepts about print. That is how books work. So now I'd like to talk about some of the fundamental building blocks for the phonics teaching process. And the first of these is this idea of concepts about print. In essence, concepts about print tell us how printed language works. So some of the fundamental pieces here are the understanding that print has a message. So when I open up a book, I realize that the little squiggles on the page contain a message. The second is the understanding of how books are organized. So when I take a book off the shelf, I know where the front of the book is. I know where to open the book and where to start reading, where to finish reading. I've realized that reading flows from left to right on the page and from top to bottom. And I also understand that printed language consists of letters, words, and sentences. Now, some kids come to school and they have this knowledge of how books work. They got it ordinarily from reading with their family, being read to by their parents or their brothers and sisters. On the other hand, there are other children who come to school and they don't have the same level of knowledge of how books work. As teachers, it's our job to help bridge that gap as much as possible by reading to our students and reading to our students, reading with our students as much as possible. And when we do this, this helps them understand how books work. Another important concept is phonemic awareness. In essence, phonemic awareness is the understanding that words are made of sounds. For example, the word cat has 3 sounds, k, a, t. Now, this has nothing to do with letters at all, but it's a very important foundational understanding to phonics. So when I understand that the word cat has 3 sounds, I'm able to take each of those sounds and match those to a letter. If I don't realize that a word is made of 3 sounds or 4 sounds or 5 sounds, I can never match those letters to sounds. And this is why phonemic awareness is a fundamental understanding for phonics. Without it, we can't teach phonics. The good news is, if students can read in Korean, they already have phonemic awareness. They develop that because Korean is an alphabet. And as they're able to match the alphabetic letters of Korean to the sounds of the Korean language, they come to that understanding that language is made up of separate sounds. And they can take that understanding and apply it to their knowledge of English. Some activities that we can use to teach phonemic awareness can be songs, rhymes, poems, wordplay. Now, any of these kinds of activities are really helpful. Rhymes in particular, because when students hear rhyming words, cat, fat, mat, hat, they start to realize, wait, these words are similar, but they're also different. And as they do that, as they realize cat and fat are similar or different, that forces them to start peeling the sounds off of individual words. And as they peel those words apart, that helps them recognize that words are made of separate sounds. Another important activity for developing phonemic awareness is simply reading. We can see the process of learning to read new words forces students to think about the connections between sounds and letters. As they think about those connections, they're developing and refining their understanding of what sounds words are made of and what letters match with those sounds. A couple of other really great activity ideas, versatile and useful, for developing phonemic awareness. One is blending. It's a simple activity. We give students 3 sounds, 4 sounds, and students have to put those sounds together to make a word. Now we see my example here is the word dog. So I could say to my students, okay students, here are 3 sounds. What word do they make? D-o-g. What word is that? Dog. Now, as they take those 3 sounds and they put them together and recreate the word dog, that helps them, again, make that connection that words are made of individual sounds. Another idea is phoneme segmentation, and that works the opposite to the one I just described. In this case, we would give the word to the student, and then the students have to figure out what sounds are in this word. So for example, if I said, okay, how many sounds, or what sounds are in the word truck? And students would have to think, truck, t-r-a-k. There are 4 sounds in the word truck. And again, as they're separating out those sounds, they're building their phonemic awareness.